stand part of the question, and I call the honourable member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is with great pleasure that I speak about this bill before the House this afternoon, because I think that this legislation, this amendment to the legislation establishing the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust, is one of the most important reforms, one of the most important pieces of legislation for the future of the great harbour that is Sydney Harbour, a part of which I have the great pleasure of representing in this House. And I say that for the singular reason that through this bill we resolve years of debate about the ongoing role for the Commonwealth in protecting these sites in perpetuity for all Australians. And with this bill, that debate comes to a close, with the government making a determined decision to ensure that these sites do remain in the hands of the people of Australia, in the custodianship of the Commonwealth and the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust for all time. And that is an appropriate outcome, because the sites that are managed by the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust represent some of the jewels in the crown that make Sydney Harbour the most incredible place, the most incredible harbour of any capital city in the world. The sites managed by the Trust encompass the full suite of Australian history, starting with the incredible legacy of tens of thousands of years of Indigenous activity around Sydney Harbour. These were sites that were of significance both culturally but also in the day-to-day lives of the Indigenous communities of Sydney Harbour. And it's appropriate that for that reason alone they're recognised for the value that we place on them today. But over the last 230-odd years, they have also borne witness to the development of Sydney as the city that it has become. In each of these sites, each with a unique and incredible story, they represent the military history, the built history, the history of Sydney Harbour as a working harbour, in a way that very few other sites around the harbour today reflect. And if I think about the broad suite of those properties managed by the harbour, from the incredible beauty and military and Indigenous history of North Head, through to the places of Georges Heights and Chowder Bay and Middlehead, which again reflect those values, to the Macquarie Lighthouse in the eastern suburbs, or the Marine Biological Research Station, a place of incredible beauty in itself, but representing some of the early marine science that was occurring in Sydney, to in my own electorate, places like Sub-Base Platypus, starting its more modern life as a gas station, then a military facility with even a torpedo manufacturing factory, through to its role as a submarine base. And over to the west, the most western property, to the Woolwich Docks in my electorate, which again had such a rich history in the life of our city. And perhaps the site that encapsulates all of those in the most dramatic way is Cockatoo Island, this gem on Sydney Harbour, with its rich Indigenous history, with its incredible built heritage, ranging from convict facilities which today ring with the sounds of the convicts that endured their sufferance on that island. You can still visit the cells where people were held in solitary confinement in the most appalling conditions, but in buildings today which we cherish and value so much, to its role as a dock, particularly in the life of the military in Australia, and to its modern incarnation, which is bringing people in more recent years for the range of activities from arts events to accommodation to camping, to events and functions which have brought this island alive in a way that merely 20 years ago would never have been dreamed of. These are phenomenal sites, and to have the opportunity to participate in the development of this bill as I have, to ensure that these sites do become a perpetual part of the life of the Commonwealth of Australia is an exciting one for me, because it's been a long-held view of mine that transferring these sites to others, be they local councils or the New South Wales Government, would be a missed opportunity to preserve them as part of the nation's historical legacy, the nation's great gesture of inheritance to future generations. So this bill is an important one for me, and I'm so thrilled that the Minister for the Environment has been able to accept some of my views but also engage with me throughout the development of this bill. Mr Deputy Speaker, the bill reflects the 20-year history of the Trust, and it is worth thinking about the fact that as we consider and debate this legislation today, it is 20 years since the Trust legislation was formally enacted. And I really want to mention and pay credit to those that were involved in the early stages of the development of the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust, because, like so much of our harbour, these sites came very close to being lost, very close to being permanently alienated from Australians. And it really was through the incredible community activism of some great people who were passionate about the suburbs they lived in, but even more passionate about the natural environment, the built environment of these sites, that we saw that community action reach a crescendo that knocked on the doors of this building and was heard by the Prime Minister of the day, John Howard, who established this trust in what I think is probably one of his most important legacies, certainly the most important legacy for the city that has been his home throughout his life. And I know that Mr Howard is exceptionally proud of the role that the Trust has played in the years since he established it. And that community action was led by a number of greats, and it's hard to list them all because it was really a mass movement. But I did particularly want to acknowledge people like Linda Bergen and Don Goodsir and Peter James, who are intimately involved in the Defenders of Sydney Harbour and the Harbour Preservation Group. And I want to particularly also acknowledge people like Kevin McCann and Peter Lowry, great friends of mine. Kevin went on to become the first chair of the Trust. But really he and Linda Bergen were the two that came knocking on the door here on behalf of their communities to advocate for the Trust's establishment and the protection of these lands. And I also want to acknowledge in those early days the great leadership that was provided by the Trust staff. Gosh, they were visionaries, they really were, and led by Jeff Bailey, they established this small agency. When Jeff moved into the office first allocated to him, it was so small he didn't even have a key. I think he had to climb through the window to get into that office on his first day. But what he built was a nimble and vibrant and future-thinking organisation that recognised that it had such a phenomenal opportunity to establish best practice in the use of these former defence lands. The whole establishment of the Trust came about because the land was under threat. It's fair to say that, with all due respect to the Department of Defence, which does such a great job in keeping us safe, it does not part with the lands which it owns, particularly for no commercial return, all that easily. And there were plans. There were plans being proposed by the Keating government, I think by then Defence Minister Beazley, to sell off some of these lands for development as housing. There were other less defined plans which would have seen these sites alienated from the community. And the Trust brought an end to any suggestion that that's what would occur. So I am thrilled that today we have the opportunity to make the life of the Trust one that does become permanent. And I want to thank, in its development, the modern iteration of those early activists, some of whom are still involved today. Your commitment to Sydney Harbour gets in your blood. It's that sea salt which throws through you that drives so many to fight battle after battle after battle to protect what's so precious. So many of the names I just mentioned were still involved with the cause today, but I particularly want to acknowledge the work of the Harbour Preservation Group, currently led by Jill Lestrange, who engaged so effectively and so well with the Minister on this legislation. I also want to thank what really was the genesis for this particular Act, and that was the review of the Trust's operations, which was established by Minister Lee and led so well by Carolyn McNally and Erin Flaherty. They provided the foundation for the issues that we're discussing in this legislation today. What this bill does is one simple thing, and it removes any suggestion that the Trust is a transitional body, that this land would somehow be lost to the Commonwealth and transferred to other levels of government or maybe even the private sector. It says the Trust is here to stay. But it also has a number of other important reforms which will enhance the operations of the Trust. And I want to mention three of those very quickly. Firstly, it does reform the board of the Trust, makes more explicit the skills that are expected of effectively the trustees of this land. And it makes clear that the board must have experience in areas like environment and heritage conservation or heritage interpretation, Indigenous culture, where I think personally the Trust can do so much more, land planning and management, business, financial, property or asset management, tourism or marketing, military service or the law. Now, some of these were part of the original specifications that were expected of the board, but I think that the clarity resulting from the review that was done is a really important step in making sure that we have trustees that are equipped to manage these sites for all their values. And I'm thrilled as part of that, pleased as part of that, that the Trust's membership still must contain someone of an Indigenous background and also someone that brings local government experience. The other reform that is encapsulated in this bill is one to do with the leasing of the lands. And it makes clear that standard leases issued by the Trust can only be leases for periods of up to 25 years, including options that might otherwise extend those leases. But what it does do is recognise that in some cases there will be leases that involve capitalising on the interests of those outside government to restore, protect and use these buildings. And in rare occasions they might require leases longer than 25 years. So it envisages a regime where leases can exist for up to 35 years, but under very strict conditions. And what this bill does, really for the first time, is locks in a requirement for the Trust to consult with the community before proposals for longer leases are developed, and still ensures that any proposals for longer leases are disallowable instruments by this parliament. But as part of that, it makes the process more practical, because it allows the Trust to bring a proposal to the community and ultimately to the Minister and the Parliament that is a proposal, so that those steps are gone through before detailed negotiations are entered into, and it therefore makes it an easier process for the Trust to be negotiating with potential leaseholders. And it also makes one very practical change, which is to reform after 20 years the threshold for which the Trust has to seek ministerial approval for contracts. Extends the current $1 million threshold to $5 million, which will make the Trust more effective in being able to manage these sites. Mr Deputy Speaker, I really do want to again thank the Minister for the way in which he has engaged, not just with me and others like the member for Wentworth who's here with me today, but more importantly with the community. I know that the community have appreciated the fact that her door has been open, that she has taken on board their suggestions. And I've had people like another one of the long-term defenders of these lands, Philip Jenkins from Hunters Hill, with whom I haven't always agreed on this or many other issues, I have to say. But Phil rang me as this legislation was introduced and said we have really enjoyed the relationship that we've been able to develop with the Minister in the development of this legislation. So to all of those involved, thank you, not just for your involvement in this legislation, but for what you have been doing on behalf of our community, on behalf of all Australians, to ensure that these sites, dating back tens of thousands of years through to the modern, have a life that will continue to protect the incredible natural, Indigenous and built values, the history of these sites, so that it's not just our generation, that in many cases for the first time, the sites having been locked up as defence bases, but many Australians for the first time are enjoying these sites, but not just this generation, but every single generation to come of Sydneysiders, of Australians, of visitors to our city will be able to explore and understand these amazingly incredible parts of Sydney Harbour. I commend the bill.